Number 1. Ronald Grey is the longest-serving prisoner on U.S. military death row. A former Army specialist stationed at Fort Bragg in the 1980s, Grey was convicted of a string of brutal crimes committed both on and off base, including 4 murders and 8 rapes between April 1986 and January 1987. Grey was just 22 years old when the first body was found, that of 18-year-old Private Laura Vickery Clay. She had been raped, stabbed, and shot before being left in a wooded area near Fort Bragg. The violence shocked the military community, but investigators didn't know at the time that this was just the beginning. Over the next several months, Fayetteville police and military authorities struggled to keep up. Women across the base stopped going out alone. Soldiers were ordered to stay alert, but the attacks didn't stop. Civilian women were abducted, assaulted, and murdered with the same brutal pattern: rape, stabbing, and gunshot wounds, often with personal items taken as trophies. Grey's arrest came in January 1987, after a surviving victim identified him following a vicious assault. When police searched his barracks and personal effects, they uncovered evidence connecting him to multiple victims, including items belonging to a civilian nurse who had been raped and murdered just months earlier. .22 caliber pistol, recovered from Grey's room, matched bullets recovered from the victims. He was tried twice, first in civilian court, where he pleaded guilty to 2 murders and multiple rapes. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. But because one of his victims was a fellow soldier, and the crimes happened in military jurisdiction, the Army launched a second prosecution under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. In April 1988, Grey faced a general court-martial. The military laid out a deeply disturbing pattern: stalking, calculated abductions, sexual assaults, and premeditated killings. Witnesses included medical experts, forensic analysts, and the 2 surviving victims. Grey did not testify in his own defense. After 4 weeks of testimony, the panel of military officers deliberated for just 2 hours before returning a unanimous death sentence. He was transferred to the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where the military keeps its death row inmates. His execution was approved by President George W. Bush in 2008, making Grey the first military death row prisoner to receive presidential authorization for execution since 1961. But the legal system intervened again. Grey's attorneys challenged the verdict on multiple grounds: improper jury instructions, ineffective legal counsel, and violations of due process. A federal district court issued a stay of execution in 2016, which remains in place. Today, Ronald Grey is still alive. He is confined in a high-security military prison, under 23-hour lockdown, surrounded by just a handful of others who've also been sentenced to death by court-martial. His appeals continue to move slowly through the courts. There is no scheduled execution date, but unlike civilian executions, where the state governor has the final say, military executions require only one signature: the President of the United States. Should a sitting president reauthorize his execution, Grey could be the first U.S. soldier executed by the military in more than 6 decades. No final meal has been served, no last words recorded, but the clock hasn't stopped. He remains to this day the most infamous face of military justice, a reminder that even within the ranks, the law does not hesitate to turn against its own. Number 2. Hasan Akbar. Hasan was an Army sergeant with the 101st Airborne Division, a unit known for its toughness, elite training, and long combat history. But in March 2003, during the opening days of the Iraq War, Akbar carried out an act that stunned the entire military. He turned on his own brothers in arms. On the night of March 23, just 2 days after the U.S. invasion of Iraq began, Akbar entered a sleeping compound near Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait. Armed with grenades and an M4 rifle, he launched a premeditated attack on his fellow soldiers as they slept. The initial explosion tore through the tent of senior officers. Chaos erupted as fire and shrapnel flew in every direction. When the smoke cleared, 2 officers were dead: Captain Christopher Seifert, 27, and Air Force Major Gregory Stone, 40. 14 others were seriously wounded, many of them permanently disabled. Akbar was captured immediately after the attack, hiding in the shadows with his rifle. He was disarmed and taken into custody by his own unit. A search of his belongings uncovered a personal diary, where he had written about his hatred for fellow soldiers and detailed plans for the ambush. One chilling entry read, "I may not get another chance to kill more of them. They've already started messing with me." The army charged him with 2 counts of premeditated murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. His trial began in April 2005 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, one of the most high-profile court-martials in modern military history. Prosecutors argued that Akbar had long-standing grievances against his unit. He reportedly felt isolated, disrespected, and discriminated against by his peers. His defense claimed mental illness, pointing to a documented history of paranoia and psychological instability, but military psychiatrists testified he was sane at the time of the attack. Witnesses at the trial included injured soldiers, commanding officers, and psychological experts. The courtroom was heavily guarded, with extra security and constant surveillance. Jurors saw photographs of the aftermath, read Akbar's journal, and heard the desperate radio calls that followed the grenade blasts. After weeks of testimony, the jury unanimously convicted Akbar. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection, becoming the first American soldier since the Vietnam War to receive a death sentence for murdering fellow U.S. troops during wartime. He was transferred to the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, joining the tiny and highly controlled population of military death row inmates. Like Ronald Grey, Akbar lives in a solitary cell, confined for 23 hours a day. His appeals have continued through the military court system and into the civilian federal courts. His lawyers have argued prosecutorial misconduct, racial bias, and ineffective counsel. But as of now, his conviction and sentence still stand. Akbar has not expressed public remorse. He remains under military custody, with no set date for execution. His meals are standard military rations, and his communication with the outside world is restricted. There is no video footage of the attack, no dramatic last stand, just a soldier in uniform who became a domestic enemy in the middle of a war zone. His name is rarely spoken today, but inside Fort Leavenworth, it's one of the most heavily guarded. Nidal Hassan. On November 5, 2009, gunfire erupted inside the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, Texas, a place where troops prepared for deployment. The shooter was not an outsider. It was Major Nidal Malik Hassan, a U.S. Army psychiatrist, armed with 2 handguns and fueled by a deadly ideology. The rampage began around 1:30 p.m. Hassan, dressed in military fatigues, stood up and shouted, "Allahu Akbar," then opened fire on dozens of unarmed soldiers and civilians. Within 10 minutes, 13 people were dead, and more than 30 others wounded. It was the deadliest mass shooting ever on a U.S. military base. Hassan had worked as an army psychiatrist for years, treating soldiers with PTSD, but behind the uniform, he had been quietly radicalizing. Investigators later uncovered email exchanges between Hassan and Anwar al-Awlaki, a notorious al-Qaeda figure based in Yemen. Despite red flags, Hassan had remained in service, even being promoted to major just months before the shooting. Victims of the attack included a pregnant soldier, a civilian physician assistant, and several young service members preparing to deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan. Witnesses said Hassan was methodical, reloading his pistol calmly, and targeting anyone who tried to flee or fight back. He was finally stopped by civilian police officers, who shot him multiple times. Hassan survived, but the bullets severed his spine, leaving him paralyzed from the chest down. The army charged him with 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted murder. Unlike other military trials, Hassan's court-martial received national attention from day one. He chose to represent himself in court, a rare and controversial move, and made no effort to deny his actions. Instead, he admitted to the shooting, claiming it was an act of war in retaliation for U.S. military actions in Muslim countries. During the trial, Hassan showed no remorse. He cross-examined victims with chilling detachment. He refused to call witnesses or mount a defense. In his opening statement, he said, "We are imperfect Muslims trying to establish the perfect religion. I am the shooter." On August 28, 2013, a military jury sentenced Hassan to death. He became the first active-duty U.S. military officer to receive a death sentence in over 50 years. The verdict required the approval of the commanding general at Fort Hood, who signed off without hesitation. Today, Hassan sits on military death row at Fort Leavenworth, like Ronald Grey and Hasan Akbar. He is confined to a wheelchair, locked in a cell for nearly 24 hours a day. He has filed multiple appeals, often citing religious persecution, but his conviction has remained untouched. Unlike civilian executions, where state laws and governors influence the timeline, Hassan's execution, like all military death sentences, requires just one final step: authorization by the President of the United States. So far, no president has signed that order. Hassan has made requests to die a martyr, calling for his own execution, but the U.S. military has remained silent. His meals are standard issue, his world, a gray-walled prison with no exit. And while his name occasionally resurfaces in media flashbacks, for the most part, he has faded from public consciousness. But the families of the fallen at Fort Hood haven't forgotten, and neither has the military justice system. One signature, and Hassan could become the first American officer executed by his own government in the modern era. Number 4. Timothy Hennis. In the spring of 1985, a brutal murder rocked Fayetteville, North Carolina, a military town bordering Fort Bragg, home to the U.S. Army's elite 82nd Airborne Division. The victims were 31-year-old Catherine Eastburn, her 5-year-old daughter Cara, and her infant daughter Erin. They were found in their home, stabbed to death, their bodies discovered by a concerned neighbor after days of silence. Catherine's husband, Gary Eastburn, was an Air Force captain stationed overseas at the time. He had left his family in North Carolina while preparing for an international transfer. The crime was so violent, so personal, that police suspected the killer was someone who knew the family. Attention soon turned to Timothy Hennis, a 27-year-old Army sergeant stationed at Fort Bragg, who had recently adopted the Eastburns' dog through a newspaper ad. Hennis was arrested and charged with all 3 murders. In 1986, a North Carolina jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. But Hennis didn't die. He appealed and won a new trial in 1989, thanks to procedural errors and questions about the eyewitness testimony. In a stunning reversal, the second jury acquitted him. Hennis walked free, returned to active duty in the Army, and served with distinction for years, even deploying to the Middle East. By all appearances, he had left the nightmare behind. But then, DNA changed everything. In the early 2000s, cold case investigators re-examined the evidence. A new test on sperm collected from Catherine Eastburn's body came back with a match: Timothy Hennis. The civilian courts couldn't touch him again because of double jeopardy, but the military had a loophole. Hennis had been on active duty when the crime occurred, and he was still subject to Uniform Code of Military Justice (UCMJ). In 2006, Hennis was recalled to active duty, essentially pulled out of retirement, so he could be tried again, but this time by a military court. In 2010, nearly 25 years after the murders, Hennis stood trial at Fort Bragg in a rare military capital case. The prosecution presented the DNA results as irrefutable proof that Hennis had raped and murdered Catherine Eastburn. They showed photos of the crime scene, called forensic experts, and walked jurors through the timeline. Hennis maintained his innocence and did not testify. His lawyers argued that the DNA only proved sex, not murder, and emphasized the lack of other physical evidence connecting him to the scene. But this time, the jury didn't buy it. Hennis was convicted again and sentenced to death. As of today, he sits on military death row at Fort Leavenworth. His execution, like all others in the military justice system, requires a direct order from the President of the United States. So far, no such order has been signed. He has exhausted most of his appeals and remains in solitary confinement. His meals are standard issue, his cell is locked tight, and he has very limited contact with the outside world. The army has said little about him since the conviction, but his name continues to circulate in legal circles as one of the rare examples of a triple trial: guilty, not guilty, then guilty again. And here's the twist that still haunts many: if not for a fluke in military law, Timothy Hennis might have gotten away with murder. As these soldiers face their final moments, we are reminded of the price of war and the consequences of actions that can never be undone. Their stories serve as a haunting testament to the complexities of military justice and the ultimate question of life and death. Will these military prisoners ever face the execution chamber? Only time will tell, but their cases remain part of the larger conversation about justice, punishment, and the human cost of conflict. If you found this video insightful, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more gripping stories from the world of true crime and military justice. Drop a comment below to share your thoughts on these cases,